Hello, and welcome to our presentation for the EPCC UTEP Mellon Humanities Collaborative. My name is Dr. Melissa Esmacher,
And I'm Jamie Sparks.
and today we're going to be presenting on our 2024-2025 academic year Mellon Research Project, A Threat to National Security, Discrimination in the Armed Forces During World War II. So the purpose of our presentation today is to talk about our process of doing research, present some of our initial findings, and then some takeaways for the future. So this project began in the summer of 2024 with a research question. How did discrimination in the armed forces jeopardize American readiness during World War II? Particularly, um, I came to this topic from my previous Mellon Fellowship in 2019 and 2020. I was able to go to the National Archives and do research on that project, and I started noticing files that had been in the personal office safe of the Secretary of War related to disturbances at military bases and talking specifically about how they felt that segregation and discrimination was undermining American readiness during World War II. And I thought this was a really interesting topic that I wanted to get a chance to revisit. So this project wants to look a little bit more in depth at what was the experience of segregated troops during World War II. How did the establishment respond to them? And how did this kind of pave the way for the future of the U.S. Armed Forces? So to start in the summer of 2024, we started where all good historians start, which is to see what has already been written on a topic, secondary source research. So one of the first books we looked at was Divisions, which specifically looked at race and racism during World War II and talked about the segregation of not only African Americans, but also Japanese Americans, and the blending in of other groups of color during the war. This book was also really helpful in that it identified several instances of disturbances at American Armed Forces bases that allowed us to generate an Excel file to kind of track some of the identified disturbances so we could start to have a picture of, are there clusters by geography, by time period, by group involved, by type of incident, to allow us to start to think about where we could narrow down our focus. And then I'll have Jamie tell you a little bit about the book Half American because she really enjoyed that one.
So, Half American was more of a thematic and flowery written book compared to Divisions. Divisions is more of a drier historical text. Half American was definitely trying to tell a story, which was just a little bit different than Divisions. So it focused more on certain individuals in the armed forces. It focused on a couple of African American soldiers that were in the Air Force before it was the Air Force. And it also touched on the supply lines, which was something that, surprising to me, Divisions did not mention at all. It Half American focused on the heroic acts that these African American captains and their ship crews would go to in order to transport goods from America to the front lines in Europe and the battles that they faced while technically not being part of the armed forces in the sense that they were given weaponry and able to fire upon enemy soldiers. I found that to be very surprising and very influential given how Divisions did not mention it at all. And it was a completely different aspect of how crucial African American soldiers were to the cause during World War II and the importance of their non-combative roles that they were in while still being in a combat zone.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of times histories of armed forces overlook what are called the merchant marines, like the folks who are the ones who are maintaining those supply lines, but not officially affiliated with an armed service branch. Divisions, I think you're right in saying that divisions kind of takes a more sort of distant dispassionate view, whereas Half American really tries to have that personal connection, right? You identify with these individuals. And then Homefront Battles is sort of a mix of the two. Homefront Battles is actually not a book that was originally on our radar in the summer of 2024 when we were doing research. What we did do, Divisions and Half American, those allowed us to stumble upon Homefront Battles, which specifically looked at World War II in the South. And in particular, allowed us to really get a lot of good detailed information on Camp Van Dorn and what happened there. So that was a good find. I'm glad we found it a little bit later in the cycle because I feel like that allowed us to fully understand the context before going into that book. So this was the first step in understanding the big picture view, especially Divisions talked a lot about the administrative side of segregation and like how the leaders of the different branches were talking about the experiences of what it was like to try to maintain separate facilities, separate chains of command, separate training, etc., and how that process and these thoughts about segregation change over the course of World War II. But once we had our sort of background information, our hit list from that Excel spreadsheet we created of incidents, we were able to start doing archival research. And we started first at UTEP's library.
So, doing archival research was a completely brand new experience for me. I had never done this before in my life, and Dr. Esmacher was crucial in showing me how to accomplish this. It's a very important thing to understand, and it's very difficult going into it blind if you don't have an experienced individual guiding you on how to do this. One of the major benefits of going to UTEP was they had their entire catalog digitized on ProQuest for the African American newspapers, which is what we were contrasting the Excel spreadsheet of riots and racial incidents against to see if anything in those time frames could be substantiated with newspaper articles, because most African American newspapers were the only ones reporting on these incidents as they were happening because it was directly affecting soldiers from their community.
Yeah, and what's nice about having this database of African American newspapers available at UTEP, unfortunately APCC didn't also have it, but UTEP did, thankfully, is like Jamie said, they were digitized, which meant they were also searchable. And when I was looking at the same kinds of newspapers during my dissertation research back in the early 2000s, they were not digitized. They were all on microfilm. So, lots of still staring at screens, those things in common between the digital databases and microfilm, but it was a lot more targeted, even though, as Jamie will tell you, the process of doing that research, she spent a lot of hours at UTEP going through those newspaper hits. And how many articles did you say you saved?
I believe I personally looked at about 2,000, maybe close to 3,000. What I was able to do is specifically look for certain areas during certain time frames, which could be narrowed all the way down to a specific day if needed. But we were looking at more broad reaching, maybe no more than a year gap. And luckily, the ProQuest catalog would tell you how many newspaper article you had, how many newspaper article hits you had per month, so you could narrow that down to the bigger ones and see if that was because of a racially charged incident or not, or weddings. There were a lot of weddings.
The social pages are
Yes.
surprisingly rich source of
Yes.
information for this,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Yeah, like we usually, when you think about historical newspapers and you are talking in the military, you're not thinking you're going to find a lot of information in the social sections of the newspapers, but that was not the case for these newspapers.
So there was a lot of information to review, and It was a little difficult to make heads or tails of some information until you're able to sit down and actually read everything from beginning to finish, because some newspaper articles would mention the same soldier, but it would talk about how he is being sentenced and serving out his sentence. And you understand that that is the end of the story, but now you have to find the information that tells you what happened and how you ended up there to begin with. So it's a lot of compiling information and trying to figure out where the beginning is and where the end is, because sometimes the newspaper articles didn't have dates attached to them. They would be cataloged with a date, but once you download the file, it does not carry over that information on, and sometimes it just wasn't printed or visibly printed on the digitized version of it. So you have to quite literally try to sew together this information to figure out what actually happened as reported in these newspapers.
Yeah, it's like doing a puzzle where the pieces are absolutely scattered, right? You'll get a piece here, a piece there in the, in the newspapers or in this book or in this archival like document. And it's challenging, but a lot of what Jamie was doing was cross-referencing and narrowing down specific dates and names of people and places. And that really helped us to narrow down and create a targeted list of what we wanted to look at in our dream trip, the trip to the National Archives and Records Administration branch located in College Park, Maryland. We were very fortunate enough to be able to get the research funds to be able to go and visit and do research at the National Archives. So doing all of this legwork of the secondary source research, of following up with that and cross-checking stuff in the newspaper databases allowed us to go to the National Archives with sort of a hit list of a few incidents we really wanted to hone in on and look at and spend our time on because we only had finite time having to travel to College Park, Maryland. Um, so this was actually my third time that I was at this particular branch of the National Archives. I got to go while I was researching my dissertation back in January 2020 for my first Mellon Humanities Collaborative grant, and now in January 2025. So even though I was an old hat at this process, this was Jamie's first time in an archive dealing with materials from the time period that we were studying, getting to see them, touch them. So what was your experience like of going to the National Archives?
It was an experience unlike anything else I have ever done. At first, it feels like a maximum security library
It is.
where there are police there. It's a very relaxed environment, very quiet because it's primarily researchers there, but you do remember that it is still a government building because of the police presence that is literally there and watching you. Um, it's very old, very musty, very quaint, beautiful setting in the middle of a forest. Um, but it's also very overwhelming because it is very obvious that if you're not familiar with the process, you are absolutely out of your depth because of the sheer amount of information that you do have access to. It's very hard to figure out where you want to start if you don't have a more experienced individual guiding you on how to do that. So filling out the pull sheets was very difficult for someone that had never done it before by understanding the methods of how you record this information so that way the archivists know exactly what to pull. In terms of actually handling the physical files, that was a completely unique experience, and I'm very, very glad to have had the opportunity to do so. Luckily, these documents are old, but they're not so old that you can't handle them. It was very interesting handling physical carbon copies in the true sense of what a carbon copy was originally intended as, which is a sheet of paper so thin that you can see 3 sheets deep if they're stacked on top of each other. They are thinner than the colloquial term thin as paper. And it is very humanizing touching these files where you can see all of the stamps, all of the signatures, all of the indentations, the handwriting on them, where you can tell who was handling this because not just by their signature, but because their penmanship is the same over the course of multiple documents. You can see that the stamps have certain dates and times on them. You can see errors that the secretaries made whenever they were typewriting these and how they corrected those errors. It's an incredible experience just seeing these living pieces of history that you otherwise would never get the opportunity to handle.
Yeah, and Jamie's right. The process of doing research at the National Archives, like everyone has this image of what archival research is like, right? From movies or TV shows where you go and they like give you these big old books or like boxes of papers and you leisurely sift through and read it. And that's not the reality. The reality is that the process of doing research at the National Archives is you have to fill out these request forms in which you have to work with an archivist to sort of translate for you how, as Jamie mentioned, to do these requests, especially because the catalog for the National Archives is uh, somewhat chaotic, not easily searchable with Boolean search operators, which is surprising, which made actually figuring out where these sources were a bit challenging. We definitely needed a lot of assistance from an archivist on site to figure out how to pull records. Um, and then following the procedures, like you'll notice the boxes on the left of this image, these were the boxes we actually requested that have files in them. And you'll notice in the image on the right, this little tag that is plopped down because most of the information we looked at was previously classified. And so even if it's been declassified, as all of the records we looked at had, we still had to go through the process of documenting that we had approval, which is what all these little tags in every state, they had to be in every single image. And a librarian walked past to make sure that you had it in every single image. Um, so yeah, so this process was also extra chaotic for us because in early January 2025, when we went, um, President Jimmy Carter had his funeral service, and so the archives were closed that day in observation. And then there was a big snowstorm that hit the DC area, which caused the archives to close for 2 snow days. So we were really sort of speed running the archive. There is no leisurely reading, right? The process, as Jamie will tell you, is skim to see whether it's relevant, and then just take a lot of pictures.
I believe I took over 1,500 pictures, and based on your file size, I believe Dr. Esmacher took over 1,600, maybe closer to 1,700. And the attack method was pull out the files, see if anything off of the first couple pages references riots, racial discrimination, mutinies, anything that could be flagged as relating to our topic of research. And if it was, take a photo of absolutely everything in that file so that way you can read it later on. And you had to be as quick as possible with doing this because there were so many pull boxes and you had such a limited amount of time to do so that you had to try to get as much done as you physically could before you were asked to leave the archival research area. They had a very hard cutoff time of 5 p.m., but all of your items had to be returned before 5 p.m. And you were also expected to be exiting the building by no later than 5:01.
Yeah, it was a baptism by fire for Jamie as our first research trip. So we knew even before we obviously we didn't know about the snow days, but we knew we were going to have tight time at the National Archives. So we went in zeroing in on a couple of disturbances from our Excel spreadsheet that we had seen pop up repeatedly in the newspapers. You'll notice that most of these incidents are clustered in 1943 with a couple in 1944. So while we were at the National Archives, we chose to focus our time, our limited time, on Camp Stewart, Georgia, Fort Bliss, Texas, Camp Van Dorn, Mississippi, and Camp Claiborne, Louisiana. We did initially pull documents for the other three instances on this timeline. However, we ran out of time to be able to evaluate them. So that's definitely a sort of future wish that we would like to be able to revisit and flesh those out. So let's talk a little bit about each of these instances that we focused on at the National Archives. So I had documents related to the first one, Camp Stewart, Georgia, which is today Fort Stewart, Georgia, still in use by the U.S. Army. And this was not one of the really major incidents of the ones that we were looking at, but it did appear the most consistently throughout the other primary sources we looked at. Jamie spent a lot of time looking at African American newspapers, but we also looked at the records related to the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP, and Camp Stewart kept popping up over and over and over again. Um, because there were lots of complaints about the poor conditions for African American troops, the low morale, and repeated instances of discrimination. In early June of 1943, the 369th Coastal Artillery Division, a Black group of soldiers, was involved in a riot at Camp Stewart. Um, One of the things you're going to see consistently across all of these riots that we're talking about is they tend to be explosions after very long simmering tensions on bases or between bases and communities. And that was certainly the case for Camp Stewart. Camp Stewart was probably the one that was most consistently scrutinized and looked at because of a sustained letter writing campaign, not just from soldiers stationed there, but also family members who they were writing to and complaining about the terrible conditions at Camp Stewart. So Fort Bliss was something that we actually went into this project knowing a lot about already, because that was what I was looking at for my first Mellon Fellowship in 2019 and 2020. Fort Bliss had a riot in June of 1943, on June 19th, among African American soldiers stationed there, based on rumors of a mob attacking Black people in downtown El Paso. This happened around this in the wake of the Zoot Suit riots in Los Angeles, and around the same time as rioting in Detroit, Michigan. Um, and in this rioting, one soldier, Private Otis Gardner, was killed. And so I did not ever manage to find the official report, the investigation of that riot. In January 2020, at my trip to the archive, we were not able to find it in January 2025. But Jamie did find the description of another incident that demonstrated the kinds of complaints and instances that soldiers of color had to deal with that tended to explain these explosions of frustration and violence.
So whenever I was going through the files for Fort Bliss, it luckily was a smaller file compared to some of the other forts and camps that we also went through. And I have read through the entire investigative report as it was in the archival research area. It focused on a unit of African American soldiers that were being moved from Massachusetts to Arizona, and they had stopped early morning at the El Paso Railroad Depot to depart, eat breakfast, and then reboard their train to continue on their journey. And what had happened was they were given the okay by a liaison for the railroad depot for these African American soldiers to eat and wait in a local restaurant, but specifically in the white waiting area. And what ended up happening was the railroad commissioner, who was a white gentleman, saw that these African American soldiers were essentially loitering in this white only area and was attempting to enforce the segregation laws, which El Paso, as a part of Texas, was under, because Texas was one of the laws that had segregation laws on the books. And he ended up trying to get these soldiers to go to the colored waiting area. And part of his methods for this was shoving one of the soldiers, Private Bird, so hard that he fell down. Whenever Private Bird stood up, he ended up punching the railroad commissioner in the face. And there was a very real threat that a racially induced riot was going to break out at approximately 7:45 on a Sunday morning in the El Paso Railroad station. And what ended up happening was their white commanding officer, Dunn, he was within the vicinity and immediately got his troops under control and settled the disagreement between the railroad commissioner and his soldiers to the extent where any racial hostilities were tampered, and they were able to depart from the train station without any further incidents happening. In the report, it was discovered that the offending soldier, Private Bird, ended up being discharged for his assault on the railroad commissioner. But the white commanding officer, Officer Dunn, was not reprimanded to any such degree. He was given something akin to a slap on the wrist, basically saying that he needed to maintain better order of his soldiers in the future, and essentially asked not to disgrace the name of the armed forces. But part of the reason why he was let off so lightly, because they were also looking on stripping him of his command, was because his soldiers had such high respect for him, as well as civilians in the area, that they wrote statements and did interviews saying that Officer Dunn had effectively communicated all information given to them, and they were following his commands to the best of their abilities, and that the railroad commissioner was the main instigator. And part of that was the railroad commander or commissioner was not accurately enforcing the law to the degree that he should have, which is where the racial tensions between him and Private Bird originated from. And because of that, Dunn was able to keep his command.
Yeah, and I feel like the popular memory in El Paso of Fort Bliss during World War II remembers incidents similar to this. Like another common story I've heard people tell about El Paso during World War II is how like Nazis were allowed to eat in a dining car first before African American soldiers, right? So there's definitely stories like this in the public consciousness, but it was really cool to get to see a detailed report of the Army in this case investigating. Camp Van Dorn in Mississippi. First of all, Camp Van Dorn was named after a Confederate general, as a lot of Army bases have been previously, now returning to, at least as of May 2025. But Camp Van Dorn, located in Mississippi, this was an interesting one because to investigate this incident, we not only were able to look at the file related to the base, but also to the regiment involved in this riot in July 1943, the 364th Regiment. Um, this file was surprisingly thick, um, partly because when we looked at the records for the 364th Regiment, we found that there was an earlier incident that had happened in Phoenix when they were stationed out there before they arrived to Camp Van Dorn. That incident was continuously mentioned after the incident at Camp Van Dorn. They kept making references to Phoenix, and we're like, what happened in Phoenix? We must look at this file as well. Um, so the impetus for the July 1943 riot at Camp Van Dorn was the shooting of a private named William Walker in May of 1943 by a local sheriff. Um, I think it's a testament to the soldiers involved that they did not immediately riot after one of their own was killed by local law enforcement in a dispute. But Camp Van Dorn had a very poor relationship with their local community, a trend that we're going to see shortly in Camp Claiborne. And Camp Van Dorn actually had multiple instances of riots, not only in July of 1943, but also in July of 1944. One of the interesting things about Camp Van Dorn was it was discussed in the Homefront Battles book. Um, that historian took pains to track down what happened to the 364th Regiment after the incident at Camp Van Dorn. When they were shipped to Camp Van Dorn, they were in the beginning stages of being deployed to Europe. And after the riot at Camp Van Dorn, which is the second major riot at a military installation that these particular troops are involved in, they were instead shipped off to serve in the Aleutians in Alaska, which was technically still a battlefront because the Japanese had invaded and occupied some of the Aleutian Islands, but definitely was seen as sort of a not a demotion, but definitely a step down from serving in combat in Europe. Um, we didn't necessarily, in the limited time we had at the National Archives, get to trace sort of the history of an entire unit like that, especially because the information is oftentimes siloed. Information about bases is in a couple different places, and then individual units are in other places. So this was really neat to see that that secondary source that we looked at kind of gave us the end of the story, so to speak. And then we have Camp Claiborne. Camp Claiborne was probably the biggest file that we looked at the National Archives, and poor Jamie, I think, spent most of her time at the National Archives on this particular base and town combination.
So, Camp Claiborne is one of three camps or forts that were located around the city Alexandria in Louisiana. So, Alexandria was a very big hub for soldiers, both white and African American, to visit on their day passes. And my research pool was divvied up between Camp Claiborne and Alexandria. And unfortunately, there was so much that I was not able to complete documenting all of this information. I believe for Alexandria specifically, I was unable to look at two full poll boxes. There is one section of interviews for filing folders where I was only able to get 50% of the way done. I was able to photograph 4 out of 8 of these interviews. And I was able to photograph everything that we had for Camp Claiborne, but there is so much information stuffed in there. And from what I could tell, it appears that it covers multiple riots, multiple incidences, and it is a little difficult to make heads or tails of because sometimes the reports are not organized as efficiently as you would like them to be, but it does cover a variety of things that happened. So one of these photos is a incomplete list because there were 2 pages of it, but this was the longest one, where it has a list of soldiers and the charges that they were given and the sentencing that they were given. There is only about 2 of these soldiers that were actually acquitted of their crimes. There were 3 to 4 of them that were sentenced to death. There were approximately 3 or 4 of them that got life imprisonment, and then the majority of them got fines and served some length of time in prison. So that gives you an idea to how dangerous these riots were, both in the physical sense, but also in the morale sense on these camps, where some of these soldiers were charged with mutiny and were put to death because of it. As far as the information from Alexandria, it appears that the segregated section of that city, called Lee Street, has seen multiple incidents of racially charged shootings or fights broken out. And the big investigation that is comprised of the interviews that I was not able to complete seems to focus around one of these incidents that happened in Lee Street where there was a shooting. It's hard to get the full picture of it because, once again, I only got 50% of the information, but apparently this was not as uncommon as you wish it would be.
Yeah, tensions between troops and the host communities that bases are located in or around is happens regardless of the identity of the individual troops. Um, You see that repeatedly, but instances of racial discrimination pretty much par for the course throughout all of the bases that we looked at in their relationships between the towns and the bases. So, what did we end up learning? Well, one of the things we wanted to dip into first, before we kind of wrap up the project, is we wanted to kind of see what the popular reaction was to segregation in the armed forces during World War II. And so, one of the ways we decided to do this was look at how Hollywood depicted the experiences of segregated soldiers. So, we looked at a couple of different films that were made immediately after World War II, especially around the time period of, say, 1948 to 1953, and to look at the World War II experience. So, two of these films, Lost Boundaries and Home of the Brave, center on the experiences of African American individuals. And then Go for Broke, despite its poster depicting a white dude, is actually about Japanese American soldiers of the 442nd, a real life division. So both Lost Boundaries and Go for Broke are based on the experiences of real people, although somewhat fictionalized. Um, Lost Boundaries is the most set in the civilian world. There's very little depiction of military life, in part because it tells the story of a Black doctor who is light enough and chooses to pass as a white man, and his life with his family in New England before he tries to enlist during World War II in the Navy, in which point his past is discovered and how that impacts his family and their relationship with the community. Home of the Brave, would we call that a very early example of a psychological melodrama? An attempt,
Yes.
half baked, if maybe.
It was a rudimentary attempt at a thematic type that Hollywood had little experience dealing with yet.
Yeah, I mean, the film talks about some like weighty subjects. Like it does openly talk about racism and bigotry. It does talk about um, what we today would recognize as PTSD. Um, and treats it in a way that we today would be like, oh my God. But yeah, Home of the Brave was specifically set in the Pacific Theater, which was also really interesting and features probably one of the bigger names of any of these films. Is it Jeff or Beau Bridges? I get the
Bo.
Beau Bridges, thank you. I get the father son confused. Beau Bridges as one of the characters in this story. And then Go for Broke is, again, a loosely fictionalized version of the story of the 442nd Japanese Americans who enlisted from Hawaii and were forced to serve in segregated units because we were at war with Japan and there were questions about the loyalty of these troops, and they were forced to serve under a white officer in the European theater of war. So these are all, as I mentioned, made in 1948 to 1953. The historical context of these films, obviously, this is after World War II, so they're reflecting on the immediate past, but it's also important to consider what's going on when these films are actually released. 1948 is the year that President Truman, via executive order, formally desegregates the U.S. Armed Forces, so there's no more separation of African Americans in the armed forces. And then 1950 to 1953 is the Korean War, in which this is the first time that integration is happening in a conflict in the armed forces. Um, Jamie, what was your reaction to viewing these films?
So I really enjoyed watching these films because they are a textbook definition of propaganda.
Yeah.
For better or worse, that was their intention. They were there to tell a very specific story and try to sway the civilian mindset, which was racism is bad.
Mhm.
These colored soldiers, because they are not white, are still foundational to our country. They are honorable men serving, willing to die for their country. They love America, and they are not less than just because they are not white. Lost Boundaries was probably the most eloquent and told the tightest storyline out of the three of them. It was a very well done drama. And you're supposed to be upset with the way the white passing family is treated once they are discovered to actually be of African American descent. You're supposed to be disgusted with how some of the secondary white characters talk about African Americans in their presence because they are highly elevated in their community, very well respected. They're Christian, they support their community, they help others in need. They are living and breathing the American values, and you're supposed to see that their race should not be a part in seeing them as less than. Home of the Brave is more of the action film out of the three of them. And it is more of a psychological thriller, and its intended depiction is to show you how hard it was for these soldiers, and that African American soldiers are just as capable of being susceptible to what we now know as PTSD, but are also worth dying for on the front lines. It's set place in a jungle, and it does showcase the type of paranoia that you can feel with the unseen enemy in a jungle battlefront. And it does also touch on the similarities between the the otherness that soldiers of color and also disabled soldiers will face, which I found to be a very unique spin right at the very end, where two of the main characters, one of them becomes disabled by losing his arm. He is able to bond with the primary African American soldier because they are both being discriminated against because they are seen as othered and less than the whole white soldiers that are part of the rest of the unit. And Go for Broke was the only movie that focused on the Japanese American soldiers. It was surprisingly also the funniest
Mhm.
out of the three. It was definitely more of a comedic type. It was a movie that was meant to be lighthearted and show you how hard these soldiers worked and fought over in the European theater, and how passionate these guys who are from Japanese heritage and also Hawaiian heritage are willing to die and put their life on the line to further the American war effort and beat the Nazis in World War II.
All right, so what did we learn throughout this process? Well, for one, we found that segregation and discrimination in the armed forces was extremely disruptive. It was very detrimental to readiness and morale. And one of the things that Divisions talks about in dealing with sort of the bureaucracy of running their armed forces is how, even though, as Jamie mentioned, there was this perception of, oh, well, African Americans or Japanese Americans are not going to be as good as soldiers, um, and this desire to discriminate and separate them, there's also, especially towards the end of the war, the logistic reality of maintaining separate facilities for training, for housing, for entertainment, um, all of these things, right? That it doesn't make sense. It contributes to lower morale of these troops because they recognize the unfairness of segregation, and it also is just financially unfeasible, right, to duplicate everything. Um, and in many ways, the experience of seeing how detrimental discrimination was to the armed forces' readiness during World War II was one of the reasons why President Truman was able to desegregate the armed forces via executive order in 1948. That process was already well in motion by the end of World War II. And most striking is the Navy, which was initially the most resistant to giving equal opportunities and treatment to African Americans and other troops of color, had done almost a complete 180 on the topic of integration and inclusion by the end of World War II. We did see that riots at military bases clustered in 1943, which is really interesting because it mirrors a wave of riots amongst civilians across the United States in places like Detroit, New York, and Los Angeles throughout the summer of 1943. And as Jamie mentioned, violence at bases oftentimes followed patterns of discrimination and conflict with surrounding bases. Jamie also noticed a very interesting pattern during our research as well, that many times African American troops were purposefully stationed at bases in the South, regardless of whether they were from there. And why is that, Jamie?
The primary context I was able to gather from a lot of the research I did via reading the books and also the newspaper articles was they wanted to take these East Coast, Northern African American civilians who had enlisted or were drafted, and they wanted to break their spirits and make them subservient and obedient to white commanding officers. And the best place to do that was in the South, where you still had segregation. You had white officers that had been part of the military for decades and were used to breaking the will of African Americans in the local community and also as employment for either the army or outside of that in local businesses.
Yeah, and Japanese American troops also were cycled through bases in the American South during World War II. Um, our final takeaway, there's a lot more research to do on this topic. As the author of Divisions, Thomas Guglielmo, notes, it took him over a decade to publish that particular book because it's a lot of information, number one. Number two, this information is siloed in a lot of different places. It's not just I go one archive, I get everything I need. A lot of this stuff is scattered. Like one of the things that we learned was that the court-martial records were actually at a completely different branch of the National Archives. So even though we would have liked to have followed up on some of the disciplinary records of some of these soldiers, especially those sentenced to life imprisonment, we were unable to do so because that would have meant going to another archive. Um, any final takeaways from your experience as a student research fellow?
It was a very eye-opening experience because as someone that has gone through US history, you understand that segregation in America is a little bit different after the Civil War. You understand that the Jim Crow laws are still on the books. You understand that the civil rights movement is where a lot of things really started changing for the community for people of color. And it was a very eye-opening experience looking at World War II and realizing just how segregated everything still was. And it's very clear that everything is teeing up for the civil rights movement that happens in the 60s because of how vocal these minority soldiers are. Because it's not just African American, it's Japanese American, it's Mexican, it's Chinese, it's Puerto Rican. These minorities are demanding for better and equal treatment. And World War II was one of the flashpoints that put a magnifying glass on that unequal treatment and also made it easier for them to demand equal treatment because of the laws that were already on the books for how soldiers are expected to be treated across the board.
Yeah, I think that's a powerful takeaway. World War II was definitely the catalyst, right, for a lot of change, not just within the armed forces, which we see in 1948, but also, as Jamie mentioned, the civil rights movement. A lot of that generation of activists were people who come of age during World War II and then really decided that the Double V for Victory campaign was legit, compete for victory abroad, but also here at home in equal treatment. So thank you so much to the Mellon Foundation for providing us the funding to be able to embark on this project. We hope you all learned a lot from our presentation. And definitely, if anybody wants to toss us more money to do more research on this in the future, definitely we would take it. But no, all joking aside, like this was a really cool project to get to do. We enjoyed working together, and we definitely love to do more on the history of World War II in the future.